Hello, Cliff Stanwick, Stanwick Real Estate, and today we are going over the purchase agreement package for buyers that was revised at the end of December 2022, and I am pleased to go over this. I think this is a critical form. They're approximately 26 pages long. The old form was 18. California Association of Realtors, in their infinite wisdom, has figured out how to make this bigger and badder, not bigger and better. And I think the summary of this video is simply this. I am going to spend over an hour talking about the residential purchase agreement. That is the new residential purchase agreement. And personally, I think the experience of using this agreement for any buyer and actually the seller, is very problematic. So I'm just going to hit my disclaimer real quick, and that is the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are my own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Real Estate Fixed Inc., who the speaker is employed by. Stanwick Real Estate is brokered by Real Estate Fixed. Full disclosure, I happen to own Real Estate Fixed Incorporated, and I am the managing broker. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The old form was great, and the reason I liked it was it walked you through the entire process of making an offer. And I'm going to hop on it and I'm going to show you the old form because I think this was a better way to do it. It just, I think we tried to make it easy for everyone to see what a summary in the middle of the offer would do. I think it's terrible because it doesn't walk you through the offer. So this is the old offer that is no longer used. It has been superseded by December 22. So we start off with the agency relationship. And that is when you enter into a discussion with a real estate agent regarding a real estate transaction, you should from the outset understand the type of agency relationship or representation you wish to have with the agent in the transaction. And it goes through the duties of what a buyer's agent is. The buyer's agent can, with the buyer's consent. And then it talks about dual agency, and it talks about responsibilities. And then it talks about how the business code which is referenced in the front, and how it applies to this agency relationship. Then we go over the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, the FHDA, which was revised in October of 2020. And we talk about discrimination. And then we roll into the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure, and consent. And basically, you are consenting in California to basically possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Basically, there's an implied dual agency that exists, and that you need to consent to it. And there's certain circumstances that happen. Then we talk about the evil wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory, and how they may be convenient, but you could get ripped off. Then we talk about the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. And I like this form. I like this form because it walks you through every aspect of making an offer. It starts with the offer, it then goes to the agency, it has a confirmation of who's being represented, it talks about the financing and the initial deposit, and if there's an increased deposit, it talks about whether there's an all-cash offer, it talks about your loans, your first offer, your first loan, if there's a second loan, how that works, whether or not you're doing an FHA or VA, and it tells you about what happens when you do here. Like you're going to have to do an FHA, VA, a mandatory clause shall be a part of the agreement if you have an FHA loan. And then it talks about additional financing terms, which, could be a gift letter from a family member, that you need for the deposit. You should probably put it in there. And then the balance of the down payment or purchase price, and then the purchase price total, and again, initial on every page. And then it rolls into what you have to do to verify your down payments and closing costs, your appraisal, contingency, and removal, how that works, and the time period for it. Then it talks about loan terms like the loan application, the loan contingency removal, okay, and no loan contingency. And it talks about the lender limits on buyer credits. And it talks about the buyer stated financing, about basically that you are buying this home based on your financing that you stated in the agreement, and that if there's any changes, like if you went from cash to a loan, the seller does not have to accommodate you in reference to any of the waivers that you did. Like an appraisal waiver could be a problem, and a loan waiver could be a problem. If you went from cash, they don't have to accommodate you. And then it also brings up that you may have a sale of your property. And then it talks about essentially the addenda and advisories that will be part of this offer, and talks about different advisories that are involved, especially if it's either a probate, a trust, or a short sale, or an REO, and a statewide buyer and seller. And then it has other terms, and then it gets into the allocation of costs after you've talked about all the terms and who's paying for what. And it does a nice job about the inspection reports and certificates, and the government requirements and retrofit, and the escrow and the title costs, and the other costs, which will be inspections and reports and other things, and a home warranty. And then it segues into the items included and excluded from the sale, and a note to the buyer and seller. And the items listed or included or excluded in the MLS flyers or marketing materials are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless they're specified in 8B or C. So that puts you on notice that if you saw it on a flyer or in the MLS, you still need to put it in the contract. And then the items included in the sale, and it talks about what fixtures and fittings are attached to the property, and it talks about existing electrical, mechanical, and all the things that are basically defined as fixtures. And then it talks about additional items, and then it talks about existing integrated phone and home automation systems, including necessary components such as internet, connected hardware devices, control unit, other than non-dedicated mobile devices, electronics, and computers, and applicable software permissions, passwords, codes, and access information are or are not included in the sale. And then it talks about leased and lien items and system, and it gives you a very nice walkthrough of all this stuff. And then it talks about the items excluded from the sale. And then it talks about, the TV brackets. Brackets attached to walls, floors, and ceilings for such component, furniture, or item shall remain with the property, or it'll be removed, and the holes and other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So again, that's interesting. They'll fix the holes, but they won't do the touch-up paint. Then we segue into closing and possession, and whether or not you intend or do not intend to occupy the property as your primary residence. And then we talk about seller occupied or vacant property and how the possession is delivered. And we talk about seller remaining in possession after the close of escrow. We talk about the tenant occupied property, or the property shall be vacant for so many days prior to the close of escrow unless otherwise agreed in writing. So here, that the tenant is out, or the tenant's going to remain in possession, right? So if you're unable to deliver property vacant in accordance with rent control or other applicable law, you may be in breach of this agreement. So that puts the seller on notice when it comes to tenants. It also becomes a problem for you, because if it's the seller's problem, it's kind of your problem, especially if you have, loan financing conditions and insurance and everything else, and you decide to close the property with a tenant still in it. So again, but what I really like about this form and the old form is it's walking you through the process, right? So now we're back at it, And we're talking about at the close of escrow how the seller assigns any warranty rights for any items that are included in sale, and that they're going to provide you keys, passwords, codes, and other means to operate all locks, mailback security systems, alarms, home automation systems. So you're kind of getting a feeling like, hey, I'm buying this house, we're going to do all these things, and then I'm going to get these things. And then it kind of goes into how the some of the statutory and other disclosures, including lead-based hazard disclosure and cancellation rights. So it talks about the time period specified that you'll get a fully completed federal lead-based paint disclosure. That's for houses built prior to 78, I believe, and a pamphlet on lead disclosures unless exempt, fully completed disclosure notices required by the sections 1102 at sequence and 1103 of the Civil Code. The statutory disclosure. Statutories include not limited to real estate transfer disclosure statement, natural hazard disclosure statement, and also the SPQ or the ESD, and then any statute. So it walks you through. Note to the buyer and seller, waiver of statutory and lead disclosures are prohibited by law. So these are the minimum disclosures that are included in every sale. There's no waiving these, okay? They have to be delivered. And then basically it talks about the time periods. Unless exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, shall complete and provide buyer with a seller property questionnaire, car form SPQ. If seller is not required to provide a TDS, seller shall complete and provide buyer with an exempt seller disclosure, car form ESD. There are certain sales like trustee sales and probate sales where there may be a exempt seller disclosure. Buyer shall, within the time specified, return signed copies of statutory lead and other disclosures. In the event of seller or seller's brokerage prior to close of escrow becomes aware of adverse conditions materially affecting the property or any material inaccuracy in disclosure, information, or representations previously provided to buyer, seller shall promptly provide a subsequent or amended disclosure notice in writing covering. However, a subsequent or amended disclosure shall not be required for conditions and material inaccuracies which buyer is otherwise aware or of which are disclosed in reports provided or obtained by buyer and ordered or paid for by buyer. Meaning if you did a home inspection and you found something that was an omission by the seller, it doesn't open the window for further investigation. Again, these are all important kind of little things to know. So we talk about the natural and environmental hazard disclosure in other booklets and how those work out. We talk about the withholding taxes. We talk about the Megan's Law database, which would give you information about registered sex offenders that may be living nearby the house on an internet website. We also talk about gas and hazardous liquid transmission pipelines. We have had some issues with those in California, and so there's a place to go look those up. We also talk about the condominium plan development disclosures, and we talk about the condition of the property and what you're, unless otherwise agreed in writing. This is something that's often missed. The property is sold as is in its present condition as of the date of acceptance and subject to buyer's investigation rights. The property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, is to be maintained in substantially the same condition on the date of acceptance, and all debris and personal property not included in the sale shall be removed by the close of escrow. And it talks about what happens if that doesn't happen, right? Buyer is strongly advised to conduct inspections of the entire property in order to determine its present condition and also its value. Seller may not be aware of all defects affecting the property and other factors the buyer considers importance. Property improvements may not be built according to code in compliance with current load or law or have permits issued. Again, these are all the stuff where this agreement is walking you through the process. And then the buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting the property, all right? This also talks about how the acceptance of the condition of the property and the things that you have the right under at buyer's expense unless otherwise agreed to conduct inspections, investigations, test surveys, and other studies. So you can do more than what you've asked for in the contract, right? And it talks about, but not limited to, a general physical inspection, an inspection for wood destroying pests and organism, an inspection would shall be prepared by a registered structural pest control, shall cover the main building and attached structures, may cover detached covers, and shall not include water tests of the shower pan or upper level unless the owners of the property below the shower consent. So people have been flooded out by those tests, okay? So again, it goes into detail of what these investigations are, and it does a really good job. And then it basically says that the seller needs to make the property available for your buyer's investigation, and basically that the seller has at no cost gets a complete copy of all your investigations, and that the seller will make sure the house utilities are on and working and everything is good to go so that you can do your buyer's investigation through the date possession is made available to the buyer, right? So again, these were all basically determined by the contingency things. Now we get into title investing, and you need to understand how you're going to hold title. So you get a preliminary title report, and that is an offer by the title insured to issue a policy of title insurance. It may not contain every item affecting the buyer's review of the preliminary report. So you need to know that there's sometimes hyperlinks and other information, and if there's stuff that says unrecorded easement, you may want to try to determine where that unrecorded part is. And then again, it talks about general index for sellers except for banks. Sellers shall within 7 days after acceptance give escrow holder a complete statement of information. This has to do with who owns the property. Title is taken in its present condition of all encumbrances, easements, covenants, contingencies, restrictions, rights, and other matters, whether of record or not. Okay, and so again, this is just a nice way where you're understanding it, and then the buyer's going to get a CLTA or EATA homeowner's policy of title insurance, and you need to understand the difference between that. A title company can provide information about the availability, coverage, and costs of other title policies and endorsements. You may want those. If the homeowner's policy is not available, buyers shall choose another policy, instruct escrow holder in writing, and shall pay for any increase in cost. Now we get into what is the drama of most of the offers, which is the time periods, removal of contingency and cancellation rights. And it walks you through how the buyer has 7 days to do this, and the buyer has 17 days for that. And it talks about how the contingencies of continuation of a contingency works, and it talks about your access to the property. And then it talks about the removal of contingencies with the offer, that you're going to remove these contingencies specified with an attached contingency removal form. If buyer removes any contingencies without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of broker. Again, if we're telling you to waive any contingency, you should not take that on face value. Waiving inspections to win the house is not good advice, for example. And now we talk about seller right to cancel, and we talk about how the notice to buyer or seller to perform. We talk about how the buyer's removal of contingencies work. We talk about the close of escrow. We talk about what happens when the sale is canceled, when we get to the end of the road here. Okay, and we talk about how deposits are returned. And then we talk about the final verification of condition. We talk about any repairs. We talk about the proration of property taxes and other items. A lot of times when you are purchasing a house, the taxes are paid through to the end of the year, or they're paid out of an escrow account, and so there may be some debits and credits on the settlement statement for prepaid property taxes and maybe some prepaid HOA fees and stuff like that. This explains to you the prorations of property taxes and other items. And again, right, I like this old form. okay? Because it walks you through the offer process and how some of the parts interrelate. And then it gets down, we're getting close to the end here. It gets back to, now we talk about the broker piece. And what's important here is to understand that, yeah, we're not working for free, and that compensation is payable upon close of escrow. If the escrow does not close as otherwise specified in the agreement between, then there is some compensation if it's specified in the agreement between the broker and that seller or buyer. Now we talk about the scope of duty. And again, this is really important to understand. We're not responsible for a lot of things. We don't decide the price, for example. We don't guarantee the condition of the property. We don't guarantee the performance, adequacy, completeness of the inspection, services, products, or repairs provided or made by the seller or others. We do not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of common areas or areas off the side of the property. We're not responsible for identifying defects on the property, and common areas are off-site unless the defects are visually observable by the inspection of a reasonably accessible areas of the property and are known to the broker. We're not responsible for inspecting public records or permits concerning the title. We're not responsible for identifying the location of boundary lines or other items affecting title. We're not responsible for verifying square footage, representation of others, or information contained in investigative reports, multiple listing services, advertisements, flyers, or other promotional materials. So our marketing can be a lie. We're still not responsible. And we're not responsible for providing legal or tax advice regarding any aspect of the transaction entered into by buyer or seller, or shall not be responsible for providing other advice or information that exceeds the knowledge, education, experience required to perform real estate license activity. Buyer and seller shall seek legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from appropriate professionals. I guess the question is, why did you hire us? You hired us because there's a lot of moving parts to this. There's a lot of representation that needs to occur. There's a lot of information that needs to be delivered and needs to be managed in the time periods for the contingencies and conditions of the purchase agreement in order to complete the sale of the property. That's why you're selling us. But there's a lot of things that we don't do, and it really comes back that you as a buyer are responsible for the investigations and understanding what we're doing here. And so we are going to tie this up. This is the old agreement, but I like it so much, I just want to go over it because the new agreement is very confusing in my opinion. So we get down to the representative capacity, where we're talking about if you're not buying a house for him or herself, that you have the authority to do this transaction. And we are talking about the joint escrow instructions to escrow holder and what their responsibility is, being the third party managing all the portions of the agreement that constitute the joint escrow instructions of the buyer and seller of the escrow holder. And we talk about time periods and the copy of the agreements and any counters and everything that needs to be delivered to the escrow. And then we are basically reaffirms that buyers are a party to the escrow for the sole purpose of compensation pursuant to paragraph 18A and paragraph D of the section titled Real Estate Brokers on page 10. Buyer and seller are irrevocably assigned to broker's compensation specified. So here's the thing where we're making sure we get paid. We talk about the deposit. Upon receipt, escrow holder shall provide seller and seller's broker verification of the buyer's deposit and funds pursuant to the contract. And then we get into the part that no one wants to deal with, is what happens if a buyer breaches the contract, and it is in huge type. So basically it's brings in the liquidated damages requirements set forth in the civil code, and it talks about how these liquidated damages work. And then it talks about dispute resolution. There's mediation and there's arbitration. And basically, in this agreement, is you agree to mediate any dispute or claim between them out of this agreement or any resulting transaction before resorting to arbitration or court action through the Car Real Estate Mediation Center for Consumers, or through any other mediation provider or service mutually agreed to by the parties. So basically, in this agreement, you are agreeing to mediation, not arbitration or court. Now, you do have that option, and you can actually exclude mediation. In general, most people don't want to deal with a problematic transaction, and it doesn't matter whether it's the buyer or the seller's fault. They just want out, and mediation is probably the best way to really understand how big of an issue you have without writing a big check. Arbitration is kind of final here. So the parties agree to arbitrate any disputes or claims of the broker in writing. The arbitrator shall be a judge, and then it basically says that you're going to have the arbitration decide by neutral as provided, and you're giving up any rights you might possess to have disputes litigated in court or jury trial. So again, when you go down the road, the arbitration is binding, the mediation is not. And so you have to figure out what's in your best interest there, and that's not your real estate agent telling you to do mediation. That's probably more in the real estate agent's best interest. Anyway, that's something that I cannot offer you any advice on. And then there's also some additional mediation arbitration terms where you can disclose what issues are excluded from mediation, a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure or other action or proceeding to enforce a deed of trust, mortgage, or installment land sale as defined in the Civil Code, an unlawful detainer action or any matter that is within the jurisdiction of probate, small claims, or bankruptcy court. So basically, if you're buying a home in any of those, if they go sideways or they don't work out, the contract was really, there's not a lot of anything you can really do in regards to getting that contract to be performed. And so another thing is it talks about preservation of actions, and it talks about brokers that were not obligated nor compelled to mediate or arbitrate unless they agree to do so in writing. Any broker's participation in mediation or arbitration shall not be deemed a party to this agreement. So again, we're not a party to this agreement, and if we participate in the arbitration and mediation, we're not a party. And again, getting back to the disclaimer here, this material is for information only, and it's not legal advice or tax advice or any of that. So again, it's important to understand that agents are not party to this agreement. And again, I really feel the old form, as you're going to see in a minute, because I'm not going to spend as much time with the new form, because I've kind of walked you through the offer process with the old form, because I really like it that much better. So let's just finish up the old form. And it talks about the selection of service providers. It talks about the MLS and how we're going to report the sale in there, and the sales price and other terms of the transaction shall be provided to the MLS. It talks about attorney's fees, and again, any proceedings or arbitration between buyer and seller arising out of this agreement, the prevailing buyer or seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs from the non-prevailing buyer or seller, except as noted. So that's where it talks about attorney's fees. It talks about assignment, which doesn't happen very often, but it does talk about how the buyer shall not assign any or part of the buyer's interest in this agreement without first having obtained a separate written consent of the seller to a specific assignee. So you just can't go off willy-nilly and assign this contract without permission. Such consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. Okay, so it has, again, any total or partial assignment shall not relieve buyer of buyer's obligations pursuant to this agreement or otherwise agreed to in writing. So again, we talk about equal housing opportunity again, even though it was in the beginning of the agreement. We talk about the terms and conditions of the offer. that this is basically an offer to purchase the property on the above terms and conditions. A liquidated damages paragraph and arbitration of disputes is incorporated into this agreement if initialed by all parties or if incorporated by mutual agreement and the counteroffer or addendum. At least one, but not all parties initial a counteroffer is required until the agreement is reached. So everybody has to agree to this agreement. And again, one person signing it or somebody signing it at a future date. I've seen that show up across my offer experience. That's not a cool thing, and it does not necessarily create a binding contract. And so again, if you're in a multiple offer situation, the other person is out of town and they don't have the authoritative or the representative capacity to do the offer, you have to think twice about accepting an offer from a person who needs to sign the contract. So we bring this up, and then we talk about time is of the essence, entire contracts and changes, right? And the bottom line is neither this agreement nor any provision in it may be extended, amended, modified, altered, or changed, except in writing signed by buyer and seller. So when you sign this agreement, that's it. There's really nothing that anybody needs to agree to unless all parties agree to. And again, I'm not trying to give legal advice. I'm just bringing up a point here. Once you sign this thing and everyone has basically ratified it or executed it, it is the agreement for buying your house. And if you miss something, which is really the point of this video, right? I'm going over this thing. I've been going on now for about 31 minutes. And I haven't even gotten to the new form, only because I like the old form that much better. But I'm trying to share with you my concerns that you're going out and buying a home and you found this home and all of a sudden you're signing a 26-page agreement, and there's a lot to understand and there's a lot to accept, and also your responsibilities and duties and commitment to get this thing done by the time periods and the implications of non-performance and what may happen to your deposit and all the other moving pieces of tenants or rent backs or replacement property or seller in possession or what do you get and how do you get it. It's really key to me for buyers to be very comfortable with this agreement, the 26 pages, which we're going to eventually get to. So the last part of this agreement talks about definitions, and definitions can be confusing. There's acceptance, there's agreement, there's a car form, there's a close of escrow, there's a copy, there's days after, there's days prior, there's delivered, delivery, delivered, there's electronic copy or electronic signature, which in my opinion is very problematic because I don't see a lot of people reading a 26 page document on an iPhone mini, okay, or an SE. Kind of tough to do. And then it talks about the expiration of offers and basically how you sign the offer, and there's a time period where that offer is alive and how that works. It's really important. You know, you only are committed to an offer while it hasn't expired. It doesn't mean that you can't accept an expired offer. It means if someone did not get you the offer back during the time periods for the expiration of the offer and they accepted your offer, you would not be under any obligation. Please verify that with your with your legal professional, with your attorney, but that's my understanding. And you're signing it, and then it doesn't mean there's an acceptance. You might see some counteroffers, you might see some addendums attached to a counteroffer, and that's a whole nother episode of what happens after the offer is submitted. And then again, we sit there and we kind of summarize the real estate brokers and that we're not parties to this agreement between the buyer and the seller. And we talk about the agency arrangements, and we talk about the cooperating compensation and the presentation of offers, that we will confirm in writing that the offer has been presented to the seller. And I'm not sure if that really exists in the new offer because, we'll see if we can find it. So then we talk about the escrow holders. And then at the bottom, we talk about presentation of offers and rejection of offers. And then, because we told you about so many things that you as a buyer are responsible for, we give you one more advisory at the end of you signing the offer. I don't know why you wouldn't see this before you sign it, but that's what they do. Is it talks about the importance of the property investigation and all the things that you are strongly advised to investigate the condition and suitability of all aspects of the property, included but not limited to the following. If you do not do so, you are acting against the advice of brokers. Well, again, whether I told you to do them or not, we have a catch-all that says you're supposed to do it, right? So this is what the old form did. And I think the old form did a really good job. So now that it's now 35 minutes and 32 seconds, let's hop in to the new form, the new purchase agreement, which is bigger and badder. And I have highlighted this because I did go over some of this stuff, but I'm going to hit it again really quickly. And that is, here's your disclosure regarding agency relationship. The long and short of it, when you enter into a discussion with a real estate agent regarding a real estate transaction, you should, from the outset, understand what type of agency relationship or representation you wish to have with the agent of the transaction. So this is the form, the 2-page form that you sign where you have elected for that agent to represent you. And then there's civil code on the second page about all the stuff that talks about how the agency works and what the agent's responsibilities are. Then we get into the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, and the first sentence is the most important. Oh, well, it's all important. Shouldn't say any of it, but I've highlighted these things just because, this is the part that I look at. All housing in California is available to all persons. Discrimination, as noted below, is prohibited by law. Resources are available for those who have experienced unequal treatment under the law. And again, I just want to pop up the disclaimer here because it's important. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. I'm not dispensing legal devices, but I am dispensing that this purchase agreement, this contract, has a lot of buyer responsibilities and duties, and the agent has a lot less than you think they do. All right? And the fact that I'm spending all this time should be something that you need to consider, that you need to see this form before you make an offer, right? Whatever I've said, whatever I've done, whatever I'm sharing here, I'm spending a lot of time going over this offer and how to make an offer in the step-by-step. Oh, you did the agency. Now you're doing the fair housing. Now we're hopping into the next part, which is essentially the limited exceptions and everything else. We talk about fair housing. Now we talk about dual agency. And basically every offer that involves a listing agent and a buyer's agent, you are consenting to potentially some aspect of dual agency. And basically the top sentence here is the point here. A real estate broker, whether a corporation, partnership, or sole proprietorship, may represent more than one buyer or seller. This multiple representation can occur through an individual license as a broker or salesperson, or through different individual brokers or salespersons, associate licensee, acting under a broker's license. The associate licensee may be working out of the same or different office locations. I am the broker. I am a salesperson. I have many buyers. I have many sellers. So I am working with more than one buyer or seller, and I am disclosing to you that I am, and you're consenting to me that I'm not exclusively yours. And there may be cases where that representation is essentially you're buying and selling, you're buying a home and selling a home from the same brokerage. And so there is a dual agency there. And this is the part that I wanted you to really notice in this form is offers not necessarily confidential. Buyers advise that seller or listing agent may disclose the existing terms and conditions of buyer's offer unless all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Whether any such information is actually disclosed depends on many factors, such as current market conditions, the prevailing practice in the real estate community, the listing agent's marketing efforts, and the instructions of the seller. You can have a confidentiality agreement on your offer. The problem is that you have to get the confidentiality agreement signed before you send over the offer. If you send over both, then your offer is not confidential. The other problem with that is it can be problematic. If it's a really great offer, then you may get beat out, and the conversation goes along like, "Have you received any offers?" Well, the answer is there in the agreement. It says in the listing agreement, it says that that the buyer's agent will disclose to other agents if there has been an offer made. Now you say you don't want your offer to be disclosed. Well, they're going to answer yes or no if they have an offer, right? And then the agents a lot of times are going to ask for the terms of that offer. And if you don't have a confidentiality agreement, they may use you as a hammer for the next buyer to get a competing offer, and then you're in the dreaded fun of multiple offers. And personally, I have been in that churn before I ever was a real estate agent, and I ended up paying more for the house, and it was a very bad experience. And I would probably want to do confidentiality of any offers. But here's the reality. It's almost impossible to keep your offer confidential, but you need to know that your numbers are going to be out there. So it really is important for your buyer's agent to have a strategy in a market where a home may be getting many offers, how to best present you as the best buyer. And that's very much the art of the game. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about the contract. So we're going to hop back in here, but I just want you to know that none of these offers are confidential. And unless there's a confidentiality agreement, but I would love to figure out how you would ever know that your information was held in confidence. It's not like a business. These are real estate agents. All right, we talk about wire fraud again and again. I've just highlighted some of this stuff. I just want to claim that this isn't me telling you that the yellow stuff is important and the rest of it isn't, but it just brings to attention to me as I go through page 6 of 26 that I just want to make sure I touch off on a lot of this stuff. Now we get into the offer. Now this is the part of the offer that we are at that I personally do not like this offer. And this is really why. We start off like we did in the last offer. We talk about who the offer's from. We talk about the agency. We talk about the potentially competing stuff. And right from the get-go, you are basically informed that buyer and seller are referred to and herein as the parties, where in the last contract it was about where you sign the offer. The other part is now we are doing the terms of purchase and allocation of costs, and we're no longer, and basically there's 16 pages after this form that you are advised to read all 16 pages. Now, if you look at the paragraph, it hops around. It starts at paragraph 5 and 5P, then it goes to 32A, then it goes to 5A, 5A1 and 2, then it goes to 5C, then it hops down to 7, then it goes back to 5D, then it goes to 5E, then it goes to paragraph 18, then it goes to 5B, then it goes to 6B, 6A and 6B, then it hops to paragraph 16 and then 23, then back to 8 and then 8 and 8A and then 8C, but also paragraph 12 and then also paragraph 8D, but also it's tied to paragraph 14A, and then also 8E is tied to paragraph 13A, and then paragraph 8F is tied to paragraph 11L, and then paragraph 8G also goes to paragraph 9B subsection 6, and then it hops back to 8J, then it goes to 7, then it goes to section 4A and 7A, then it goes to section 14A, 19B, 11L subparagraph 2, paragraph 10, 10B subparagraph subsection 1, then paragraph 28, then it hops into items included in the sale, which is paragraphs 9, and then it goes to paragraphs allocation of costs, which are paragraphs 10A and 11A, and then 10B subsection 1 and 10A and 10B subsection 2 and 10B subsection 2. Then it hops to 19B, 13B, and then buyer's lender title policy isn't in there, but it's part of the deal. And then county transfer taxes is not referenced, and city transfer taxes aren't referenced. And then it goes to paragraph 11L subsection 2, and then it goes to the HOA isn't referenced, and the HOA, it's probably that same 11L subsection 2. Then it goes to paragraph 10C, and then there's other terms. Then it hops into all the property addendum and advisories. This is purely why I do not like this form, especially if you are in the middle of writing an offer and you saw how I spent all that time showing how the other offer walked you through all the little pieces of how it works from the allocation of costs and how it applies. What we've done is we have just created this hot mess of a summary page for you to fill out first, and then we go back. All right, so on this summary page, and we're going to go through top to bottom here, you're going to do your purchase price, your close of escrow, your expiration of offer. You're also going to talk about your initial deposit amount, and you should know that should be 1 to 3% of the purchase price. You should talk about an increased deposit if it makes sense. The loan amounts go there if you haven't opted out at the top as an all-cash offer. Then you're going to talk about any additional finance amount. You're going to also declare your occupancy. You're also, if you notice here, we don't mention the fact that you have a contingency yet for any replacement property if that was something you're going to do. So now we get into the terms and conditions, and we bring up a seller credit, and you would have to know what seller credit would you be asking for with an offer. Most likely it would be a closing cost credit, and you would need to know what amount of closing cost credit that you may need for financing, and that could be a condition of the financing. Like when we get into this loan here, the loan amounts, we may have wanted to put a note in there somewhere, right? So here we are, we have some seller credit, and this comes into the additional finance terms. You may want to inform the seller that if you don't get the seller credit, you can't, that the financing is dependent on a 3% seller credit for lender allowed closing costs, right? And the other part is that if you have any commission relationship for the agent buying you a property, and it could be more or less than the commission offered by the seller, this is where you would bring that up. And then we talk about the verifications of an all-cash offer. We talk about the verifications of down payment and closing costs, and that applies whether you have a loan or not. Then we talk about your loan applications, and basically, your pre-qualification may be subject to a fully completed loan application. So again, you need to understand the difference between pre-qualification, pre-approval, and a fully underwritten pre-approval, and you need to understand, what should you be giving to that buyer. That seller. And the other thing is now we talk about the final verification of condition, which I think is kind of funny because that's kind of at the end. But right now, it's right here is the, after the intentionally left blank, we're talking about the final verification of condition. And you you haven't read all the stuff, but now you're deciding on that. Now it's talking about the assignment requests, and you realize from the last one, I told you how assignments work. So what are you agreeing to with these time periods? And then the other thing I want to share with you, there's a lot of time periods on here, but if you haven't read the entire agreement, right? If you haven't read the entire agreement and understand it, you really can't figure out how these contingencies work. And if you don't understand the process, it becomes even more problematic. And these time to remove contingencies, this next section I'm going to go over, I'm going to point out to you some real issues that came out of this new summary format. And it starts right here. It starts with the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency. You cannot get a loan approved without an appraisal being submitted to the bank. They're not going to get submitted the same day. So if you use all 17 days to get your appraisal contingency released, you're not going to have your loan done. The old contract was 17 days for an appraisal, 21 days for a loan. So really, you should have the appraisal contingency in front of the loans. And the fact that these standardized times of 17 days doesn't even work. And then you also have to understand that when you start waiving these contingencies, especially with the offer, that you need to actually submit a contingency removal form, and it needs to be attached, all right? And that applies to the investigation of property, and the informational access to property is the time you have to enter the property during the entire time of the sale, or does it end after the investigation of property? Right now you have 17 days on the property. Day 18, you don't have access via the purchase agreement to go onto the property until the verification of condition, which most of the times is after the 17 days. Confusing? Yeah, probably. It's confusing. So again, we're talking about contingency. So now we're talking about the review of seller documents. You have 17 days. You're talking about the preliminary title. You have 17 days, or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. So even if you shorten the time and you say 0, you have 5 days. Unless somehow you've made it a part of the additional term, or you have waived that contingency in the contingency release. Again, complicated. Same thing with common interest subdivision. You have 17 days or 5 days after delivery. Chances are you should not waive those common interest disclosures, because you're not even going to see them even within 5 days, anytime. It takes time. Review of leased or liened items. Again, you may or may not know what leased or liened items are, but you have 17 days after acceptance, and it says such as solar panels. Could be other things as well. There could be a backup generator. Sale of buyer's property finally shows up on this thing, and that you should have a car form COP attached. And the conditions on that also impact all the time frames of the time periods for the contingencies. And so that form is critical if you elect to also understand how it impacts, and the seller needs to understand how those time periods impact, and you want to make sure that you construct this or submit a COP in a manner that doesn't blow up. And again, that's those are very problematic, but a good agent should be able to ascertain what are the friction points with the seller and make it work. Now we talk about time for performance, which again is kind of funny because it's after the contingency. So this talks about time of possession, seller occupied or vacant units, and then it talks about occupied units by other tenants, and the time periods and the forms and the rent backs, whether it's a lease or whether it's a seller in possession, and if there's an occupied by tenants, the TOPA agreement. And then we're talking about, finally, we've gone through what you're supposed to do. Now you're seeing what the documents are supposed to be given by the seller. So the seller delivery of documents is 7 days, but you need to go back and look at your investigation of property. You've got 17 days. Well, you're not getting forms for 7 days. That gives you 10 days to look at them. Well, if you have a 10-day inspection period, you really have only 3 days to look at them. But another part of it says that you should have 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. So again, these time period things become very problematic, and because of the summary form, you don't really get a good feeling for how this contract's supposed to work and all the moving parts. And this is why I really don't like the user experience that is delivered by the residential purchase agreement, because they wanted to have a summary page. So let's keep going. We've gone through the seller delivery of documents. Now we're talking about stuff that's included in the sale. And there's a lot of things that before in the old contract was not included in the sale, but you have an election to do it. Like a lot of times, the smart home control devices, they weren't fixtures, or the security systems, and, other than the separate video doorbell and camera equipment. Again, it becomes complicated. You really need to make sure that if there are things in general, that if you buy a house, you want security systems, or you want the washer and dryer, or you want all the refrigerators, including the mini bars, fridge, and the ice maker, you need to make sure that your agent has had a conversation and found out what things are included in the sale and what things are not included in the sale. And you shouldn't assume just because the items are included on this list that there's something that is typically included in a sale. I can guarantee you refrigerators in general are not included in a sale. And wine refrigerators, they could be if they're built in, but again, not. Washers and dryers, typically not. Dishwashers, typically they're built in, yes. Microwaves, if they're built in. Right, all these things, above ground pools and spas, again, usually not included. And again, electric charging systems and stations, not typically included, but it is mounted to the house. And, again, that, potted trees and shrubs, typically they're potted, and that means they can move, and they're not included. And they may be something that isn't negotiable. And then there's additional items included. And again, I feel a lot of these included items, you should negotiate those before, or understand if they're negotiable before you put them in the contract. My recommendation is price and terms, and worry about the little things like items included later or in the counteroffer. Now we get into allocations of costs, which, as you know, was done very earlier, like on page 3 or 4 of the old contract. Now it's on page 9, and here we are. We're talking about the natural hazard disclosure, who pays for that. We're talking about smoke alarms, detectors, who pays for that. Typically, the natural hazard disclosure in this area is paid for by the seller. A lot of times, pest inspections are paid by the buyer. Roof inspections are paid by the buyer. Smoke alarms are usually a compliance issue. They're done by the seller. A lot of the point of sale inspection reports are usually done by sellers. Also, any corrective remedial actions, those, if they've been done, should be paid by the seller, especially if they're in relation to code. In my opinion, again, you should determine the implications with your professionals that are not real estate agents. Then we talk about the escrow fee, the owner's title policy. Typically, escrow is split in South Placer County. The owner's title policy is usually paid by the seller. In my opinion, they're assuring you that they're selling you a good house. I don't think you should have to pay $1,000 to $2,000 only to find out the house had a problem. The buyer's lender policy, that usually is paid by the buyer, and that's in regards to a loan. Okay, a cash buyer does not have a buyer's lender policy. Makes sense. The county transfer taxes and the private transfer fees are not referenced in the contract, but they are part of fees that may be on there. My personal opinion is you should have the seller pay for those, only because it just takes some of the guesstimate out of it. And if you have to pay for them, it's just additional closing costs in a very expensive rate market. Again, there's some other fees here or costs. That could be well inspections or septic inspections or the sewer line to the street. Home warranties are discussed here. It's not, you should check the MLS. Sometimes a lot of sellers include a home warranty. And then you should understand that your buyer, as a buyer, you're the one that should fill out the warranty. Not just sharing with you, having your agent fill out the warranty. They might forget something that is really important to you, or you may not know that you had the option to insure the well pump or the septic pump or the roof or the appliances. Like they got a Sub-Zero and you'd like to insure the Sub-Zero for a year because they're real expensive to get work done. Okay, so this is the nonsense of this summary form. You basically have filled out all this stuff, and now the next 16 pages of this agreement is going over all the things you summarized, and the other addenda and advisories and addenda and the buyer and seller advisories and a whole bunch of paperwork that in the old offer you pretty much had a feeling, or at least you had some knowledge of these forms would impact your offer or are part of the offer. I shouldn't say impact. So now I'm hopefully going to be able to go through this faster because I did the old form. Now the next 16 pages of this form, and now we're up to over an hour. We've hit the 1 hour mark, is going over all the other addenda and advisories. And again, I'm not going to, I've highlighted this all in yellow because personally I need to kind of cover off on all of this. And this is, again, the point of this video. The point of this video is I'm recommending that you have seen this purchase agreement well before the time you make your first offer, that you understand that you could ask for closing costs. You can ask for certain things in a deal, and you need to understand what lender allowed closing costs are, and you need to understand the amount of them, and you need to understand what is typically included in a sale. If you see all these items, hey, can I ask for the security system? This form's a little different than the last form, as you're going to find out. So I'm going to try to go through this because I discussed it in the last one, but I'm encouraging everyone to read I'm advising you need to read every page after the summary and really understand all the moving pieces. So we're going to go back at it. We're at a little over an hour. Hopefully I can get this done in a reasonable amount of time. So now we're up to page 10 of 26. So we have 16 more pages of the offer. This is where we're going to talk about all the addendum and advisories that may apply to this offer. And a lot of them have to apply whether there's a tenant, whether it's a probate sale, whether it's a manufactured home, whether your title is going to be have tenancy in common. And again, you need to understand how you're going to take title to the property. So the next three apply to the title of the property, the tenancy in common addendum, the stock cooperative purchase addendum, the mixed use purchase addendum. And then we have all the other addendum, which a lot of times addendums would be written for escalations. I'm not going to talk about escalations. I think they're very problematic. That's all I'll say. We'll talk about whether it's a short sale or whether there's court confirmation involved, whether you're a backup offer because an offer's been accepted. That would be your ability to turn this offer into a backup offer. This would talk about if the house has a septic well, is on property, or has a propane tank. This is the form you would use. This is about if there's an intent to exchange, meaning you're selling a house and you want to exchange, do a property exchange. This would be the forms you use, and whether the buyer and the seller are doing a property exchange. And of course, there is a fallout for more addenda. Imagine that. And then we talk about buyer and seller advisories. And of course, you've already opted in with the purchase bundle, the buyer's investigation advisory, the wire fraud advisory, the Fair Housing and Discrimination advisory, the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory. And there's also ones that apply right now in California. Should almost be a default, which is the wildfire disaster advisory. And then the statewide buyer and seller advisory literally becomes part of every offer on any house, just because it brings up a lot of issues that have been determined by the state as things that buyers and sellers should know about and disclose. Then we talk about more aspects of the sale, as far as if there's a trust involved, or whether it's a short sale or a probate sale or an REO advisory. And again, those buyer and seller advisories are in there. As we've covered before, we talk about the initial deposit, we talk about increased deposits, we talk about the retention of deposits, we talk about all cash offers and how those work, that there's no loan contingency, and the agreement is not contingent on buyer obtaining a loan, and that's the implication of an all-cash loan. Now, if you have a loan, we talk about your first loan, and that it defaults to conventional financing unless you elect an FHA, VA, or seller financing, and that is checked in 3E1. And we talk about the additional finance amount. So again, we're going back, and now we're filling in the detail of the summary here. And again, this is what I really don't think is helpful. It isn't helpful for you to complete a summary and then to be advised to read these other 16 pages. It would have been really simple for California Association of Realtor to basically post all the summary information on the last 2 pages and have you initial that you verify, or that this is, in your estimate, what the summary offer is. Okay, it's problematic, and the percentages, all that stuff is problematic, and personally I don't like it, but here we are. We're explaining all the things you filled out on the summary. So now we're talking about the balance of the purchase price, and we're talking about the limits on credits to buyer, which now you're finding out that any of these things, closing or other costs, have to be agreed to by the parties, shall be disclosed to the lender, and how that works. We're talking about additional financing terms, which is the verification of the down payment, the verification of the loan applications, and how those work. We're talking about buyer-stated financing, and now that's improvement. Now here you're finding out that if you say you're a cash sale and you go to a loan, there's some impact to that, and essentially the buyer's inability to obtain alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation to purchase the property and close escrow as specified in the agreement. Now we're talking about closing and possession, and we're talking about the occupancy, and we're talking about shall or shall disclose the buyer if occupied by tenants or persons other than sellers, and attach a form TOPA in the counteroffer if not part of the buyer's offer. So again, you're supposed to know if anyone besides the owners are living in the property. The condition of the property on the closing. Basically, this is where we tell you that you're buying this property as is in its present physical condition as of the date of this acceptance, and the condition of the property should remain in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance. And it's also talking about that debris and personal property should be removed, and it is also talking about what happens if the debris and personal property, if they leave you a dirty property, which, to be frank, is not a good situation. I'll let you read the information. So basically, your buyer is strongly advised to conduct inspections of the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller and agents may not be aware of all defects affecting the property and other factors that buyer considers important. Property improvements may not be built according to code and compliance with current law, or have all required permits issued and or finalized. So again, you learn in this thing that seller may disclose that the house is permitted or not permitted, but he doesn't necessarily have to tell you exactly what is. It could be to the best of his knowledge or whatever. At the end, you may want to make it a condition of your offer that the house needs to be 100% permitted. But again, you already did your summary, so now you're hopping back and forth like a yo-yo to figure out what other things maybe were missed in the summary, and now you have to go back. So we talk about, again, seller remaining in possession after close of escrow, and what happens at the close of escrow. And to be frank, these are very complex situations, and that you really need to talk to your lender, and you also need to talk to your insurance agent about any of these situations that happen with seller remaining in possession. Now we finally get, after you filled out all these contingencies, you'll notice that the reference of these contingencies, like 7 days or 10 days or 3 days or 5 days, is entirely missing because they've been summarized. So now you're going through all this information on contingencies and removal of contingencies. And to be frank, you're not necessarily know what the original contingency is. You know some of the catch-alls, but this is another problem I really have with this form, right? So now we're talking about contingency removal, and the removal of contingencies otherwise specified in 3L1 or the attached contingency reform. If there's no appraisal contingency or appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, the failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle buyer to exercise a cancellation right pursuant to the loan contingency. If the buyer is otherwise qualified for the specific loan and buyer is able to satisfy lender's non-appraisal condition for the closing loan. So anyway, right, buyers are advised to investigate the insurability of the property. That is a loan condition. Buyer has contractual obligations regarding deposit balance of down payment and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement unless otherwise agreed. So if you had a gift letter to help you get your down payment and whatever, and you didn't make it a condition of your financing, you've opened that door to your deposit not being at risk if you cancel because of you waiving a loan contingency. Now we talk about the appraisal contingency again, right? Otherwise specified in paragraph 3L2. So now you got to go back and say, well, did I shorten it? Did I make it longer? What did I do? And then it does talk about if you're unable to obtain loan specified for this reason, seller may be entitled to buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. And then it talks about the Fair Appraisal Act, and the parties acknowledge receipt of the attached Fair Appraisal Act addendum. It's checked off by default, right? So I don't even know what that is. That just goes to show you I learn something new all the time. Investigation of the property. Now we're talking about the investigation of the property again, like we haven't talked about it enough. The agreement is specified in 3L3, and then you have to go to paragraph 11. This is the herky-jerky nature of this contract that I cannot, recommend and share or bring you my concern that you should not be filling this out for the first time seeing it because you found your dream home and now you're making an offer. It's a hot mess here, and I'm not kidding when I tell you that. So now we talk about the investigation of the property. We talk about the review of the seller's documents, which again, we're in the summary about how that was specified, and then it's contingent upon the buyer's review and approval of the seller's document in paragraph 14A. We're not even on paragraph 9 yet, and it's telling you to go 5 paragraphs ahead so that you understand how the review of the seller documents is. Now we're talking about the title, which again is specified in 3L5, contingent upon the buyer's ability to obtain title insurance provided for paragraph 13G, and buyer's review of the current preliminary report and items that are disclosed or observable even on the record as specified by the preliminary report. Basically, it also brings up that you have 5 days after receipt to review a revised preliminary report, if any, furnished by the title company. I can't share with you enough that there's often mistakes with the title report, and it's really in your best interest to read that title report and to also demand a corrected title report, and you have 5 days to review that. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've done this that I find an issue on the title report that I bring up to the buyer, and then we get a new title report, and then everyone's upset because we basically have problems with the loan because the lender needs a current title report. So again, title is really important, and it's important you understand the implications of title. But again, the way this document is written, or the form is presented, it's really terrible. All right, so now we move on to whether or not it's a condominium plan unit, development, disclosure applicable. In the old form, you would have checked it off, and now you have to think about it, and you have to go back to paragraph 3L, subsection 6, and then buyer review of leased or lien items contingency, and explains how that works. And it references again paragraph 9B, subsection 6, and paragraph 3L, subsection 7, and paragraph 3, subsection 7 about that the notice to buyer to perform and may cancel this agreement by the time specified. So now we're getting into all sorts of this. Again, falls under the buyer investigation stuff. And now we talk about the removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer, that the buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless the seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosure, and information pertaining to that contingency. Well, now you'll get into this whole gambit of removal of contingencies or cancellation, and notice to buyer to perform and all sorts of stuff like that is something that is not presented very well in this contract, but is something that can happen, because right here it's mentioned to you about the removal or waiver of contingencies, and basically that buyer is going to get some notice to perform, but it doesn't talk about the notice to perform until a later paragraph. So again, we're talking about items included and not included in the sale. It talks about if it's in the MLS, but it's not in the contract, too bad. Which again is that whole thing about what's in the contract is in the contract, and if you have to amend it or change it, it's too bad. And then items included in the sale, it talks about all fixtures and fittings that are included in the property. And again, it's important that you understand what a fixture and a fitting is, and I don't think that this necessarily does an awesome job of doing that. And it says if seller does not intend to include any item specified as being included above because it is not owned by the seller, whether placed on the property by agent, stager, or other third party, the item should be listed as being excluded in paragraph 3B or excluded by seller in the counteroffer. A lot of times you love that couch and it's staging. You have to work with the stager. Security systems include any devices, hardware, software, or control units to monitor or secure the property. Included but not limited to any motion detectors, door or window alarms, or any other equipment utilized for such purposes. If checked in paragraph 3P, all items are included in the sale, whether hardwired or not. Again, we have a tremendous problem with the fact that a lot of these security cameras are movable and move around, and they're not technically fixtures, and they're not technically part of the property that transfers, but you may include them or not include them. And this is becoming really a hot mess for buyers to negotiate these security and video systems, right? And then non-dedicated devices, whatever that means, that goes over. Now we're talking about leased or liened items and systems, and those become pretty complicated because you may not be able to assume the lease, or you may have to buy out the lease, and there may be a cost with that, and you may not know that there is a leased or lien items, and you don't have a stipulation in there that the seller shall free from any encumbrances, any liens or loans on any systems, solar systems with the house, for example, right? They may, you know, in the MLS, it may say you're going to assume that liability. And again, the leased and lien items have become a big negotiating challenge in real estate, right? So basically, seller represent all the items included in the purchase price unless otherwise agreed, are owned by the seller and shall be transferred free and clear of liens and encumbrances except for items and systems identified, right? And they're transferred without seller warranty regardless of value, right? So again, you may be thinking you're getting a warranty, but the seller's not warranting it. So again, these are some of the challenges of this, and you're seeing this after you filled out the summary. And again, not a great experience. Allocation of costs. Now we're talking about the allocation of the costs. We're on page 13, and we're talking about who pays for those and determines who. It does not determine who's to pay for any work recommended or identified in such document. Agreements for payment of required work should be specified elsewhere in paragraph 3Q or 3R, or in a separate agreement such as car forms RR, RRR, ADM, or AEA. So now you're talking about requests for repairs, which again, you don't even know if that form is going to be used because you're buying the property as is. So government requirements and corrective act or remedial action, you should read these legally required installation or property improvements. You need to understand the point of sale requirements. You need to understand how re-inspection fees work. If any repair in paragraph 10B subsection 1 is not completed within the time frame for the lender requires an additional inspection to be made, seller shall be responsible for any corresponding re-inspection fee. If buyer incurs costs to comply with lender requirements concerning those items, seller shall be responsible for those costs. I'll give you a classic. You sent over a form that said that you had all the compliance for smoke detectors and carbon monoxide compliance, and water heater strapped. Well, appraiser came in, and certain appraisers will call out improper water heater strapping, and they'll say that you don't have the carbon monoxide monitor near living areas or on the appropriate living spaces or near bedrooms, and they will make the appraisal subject to a re-inspection. Well, you get to pay for it, right? So the seller gets to pay for it. So again, you know, what happens is these re-inspections happen and the seller can't believe that they're paying for your appraiser to come back out. Well, they are. And so again, you need to know your rights, but you also need to know that maybe you don't want to make a huge issue of it. But neither here nor there is kind of an opinion. Home warranties. You know, everybody has an opinion. I think if you're buying an older home and you can have some elections for the air conditioning or some of the older appliances until you replace them for a year, or any systems that you're not sure about, you know, septic systems, pumps, you know, roofs, windows. I don't think it's a bad idea to have a small insurance policy of a home warranty. This goes over the home warranty. And then we start talking about the statutory and other disclosures. This was in the earlier form when we talked about basically the TDS and the NHD. And here you're talking about the SPQ. And then also we're bringing up the Melrose Community, you know, acts and all the forms that you need. Finally, we're talking about that, and that's on page 14. And we're talking about lead disclosures, which apply to houses built before January 1st, 1978. And we're talking about how those time periods apply. One that is something that really impacts sales are these home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. And it's because there may be some fire hardening disclosure requirements from where you live, and there may be some defensible space parts. So this is really important, and it's now part of the TDS in some way, and this is where we talk about that. And it also mentions that the waiver is prohibited. Waiver of statutory lead and other disclosures in paragraph 11A, subsection 1, 11B, 11C, 11D are prohibited by law. Return of signed copies, this is what we talk about, where within the time specified or 5 days after delivery of any disclosures specified in paragraphs 11A, B, C, or D, and defensible space addendum in paragraph 11D, whichever is later, return signed copies of disclosures and or applicable addendum to sellers. So you have 5 days after you receive these disclosures to get them back. It doesn't mean that you've accepted them. It's really meant that you've received them. Now we talk about termination rights again, which is the statutory and other disclosures and how they work. The defensible space compliance can be a very big cost, and the buyer does not agree to the items regarding defensible space compliance delivered by seller as indicated by mutual signature on the FHDS. Then seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel the agreement. So again, the defensible space compliance can be a problem in areas of wildfire. So you need to understand that, hey, the buyer does not agree to the terms for the space, and as indicated by mutual signature, then the seller could cancel the agreement. Now we talk about withholding taxes, and that applies a lot of times to who's absolutely responsible for those withholding taxes. Well, without the proper paperwork, the buyer is responsible for any withholding. So this is very important that you understand how these work. And buyer and seller hereby instruct the escrow holder to withhold the applicable required amounts to comply with federal and California withholding laws and forward such amounts to the IRS and franchise tax board respectively. However, no federal withholding is required if prior to close the escrow, seller delivers the buyer and escrow holder a fully completed affidavit, CAR Form AS sufficient to avoid withholding pursuant to the federal withholding law, FHDA, or a qualified substitute. Qualified substitute is important to understand because a qualified substitute is your escrow company, and they can make sure that those are done. And you should realize that executing those forms discloses very personal identification information like Social Security and legal names of people. And so I prefer having the qualified substitute take care of that. I still see agents sending that AS form and the FHDA over, and they don't seem to realize that the escrow company can do it. And then I don't have the liability of having anyone's Social Security number, which I really don't want. Notice regarding gas and hazardous liquid pipelines, that should be up on the NHD, but again, there is a place to go look at it. And then we talk about the NHD, the natural environmental hazard, paragraphs 3 and 1, and then we talk about the time frames, and we talk about the disclosure of pending or any anticipated claims or litigation against the HOA, and the importance of the HOA docs, which again are very problematic. And then we also talk about solar systems. A lot of times with solar systems, they are problematic, especially if they are not owned. And also that you need, with any solar panels or solar power systems, seller shall, with the time specified, delivered buyer all known information about the solar panels, solar systems. Seller may use the solar advisory and questionnaire. So that's a new form. It's not statutory, but you really need to include the solar form in the disclosures, right? And again, that's a miss I see a lot of times with solar systems, and I'm glad they put it in the new form, but I don't like the fact that it's really not referenced in the additional forms or in the terms on the right side that you should be been given this CAR form, ARC, and also it's an important piece, right? So now we talk about known material facts. So material facts are a huge, huge disclosure issue in the sale of a home. And it used to be you would know about material facts pretty much before you got to the end of the offer. But here we are, page 15. Disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, included but not limited to known insurance claim within the last 5 years, or provide buyer with permission to contact insurer to get such information, and make any or all other disclosures required by law. Now, it doesn't go into the fact that agents have a duty of material facts, but it is in some of the agency disclosure. Buyer investigation of property and materials affecting property. This gets back into your buyer's investigation, and it talks about the duties of both buyers and sellers to make this investigation of property complete. And it talks about the time period back on page 3 or page 1, and it talks about the right and expense unless otherwise agreed. And then it talks about are not limited to just inspections in a general home. It's basically any other specific inspections of the physical condition of the land and improvements. Investigation of any other matter affecting the property other than those that are specified as separate contingencies. Buyer's investigation include, but are not limited to, the investigation, availability, and cost of general homeowners insurance, flood insurance, and fire insurance. Say buyer's investigation advisory for more. Basically, it also says that the buyer doesn't necessarily need to move any existing personal property, so you can complete the pest inspection, which is a lot of times called out. And basically that you need to complete the buyer's investigation and satisfy themselves as a condition of the property and remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. So now we're talking about all sorts of other stuff, and the buyer indemnify and seller protection of entry. So this is where the buyer is going to indemnify and protect you for entering the property from any damage arising from your investigation, indemnify and hold the seller harmless from all the resulting liability claims, demands, damages, and costs. Buyer shall carry, or buyer shall require anyone acting on buyer's behalf to carry policies of liability, workers' compensation, or other applicable insurance defending and protecting seller from liability for any injuries or persons that occurring from the buyer's investigation. So it really comes down to, having your whole family on the property. That could be a problem, especially if it's only the buyer and the seller buying the property, and then they hurt themselves, right? So again, this just talks about the responsibility. So now again, we're talking about title investing, and buyer shall, within the written time frame, be provided a current preliminary title report, and the title is taken in the present condition. And we talk about the seller within 7 days after request give escrow holder necessary information to clear title. That's usually if there's any loans or anything like that, or any liens. Basically disclose to buyer all matters known to the seller affecting title within the time period. And then the buyer is a legal entity and the property purchase price is at least $300,000. It talks about how that sale, if it's cash without a bank loan, is going to be reported to the federal government through the geographic targeting order, and you need to be aware of that. And then the buyer shall, after the close of title, what they're going to receive. And then basically the manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Consult an appropriate professional. It also talks about the title policy you're going to be received, and that you need to understand that it is a CLA standard coverage policy unless buyer has chosen another policy and instructed escrow holder in writing. Basically, the cost of any difference between an ALTA and a CLT homeowners policy and a CLA TA standard policy and other title policies and endorsement. Buyers should receive notice from the title company. Just a lot of stuff here. Now, we're finally getting to the time periods, removal of contingency and cancellation rights. And it's talking about the delivery of the documents that we specified earlier and how they, who the seller is responsible for. It's talking about your review of the documents, all right? And then it's talking about what happens if documents are received during the time period, but prior to the time period basically being up, and how you have 5 days after the delivery of such items or the time specified in paragraph 3L. We basically get into a lot of gymnastics with this form. And this is a big problem. These forms in regards to um, time periods and the contingency removal and or the cancellation. So we're going over all the time periods here and removal of contingency and the cancellation rights. And now we're getting into the essentially some of the fun stuff here where basically the seller within the time period requests the seller make repairs or take any other action regarding the property, and that is in a series of forms called request for repairs and the seller response for the request for repairs, and it goes back and forth. And if the seller does not agree or does not respond, buyer is not contractually entitled to have the repairs or other requests made and may only cancel based on the contingencies in this agreement. So we get into the hot mess of requests for repairs, and in spite of you buying the house as is and then finding these big issues, the sellers are never under any obligation to make any repairs, and your only recourse is really is to make a request for repairs and then send a notice of the form to have the seller either agree to make the repairs or not make the repairs. And if they don't make the repairs, then you basically cancel the agreement. So now we're getting in the seller right to cancel too. The sellers have some right to cancel, and those are based on buyer contingencies and buyer contract obligations, and it gets back to the summary stuff. And then the seller right to cancel and seller contingencies. If they have any contingencies like replacement property, they can cancel the agreement by good faith exercise, meaning they couldn't find a house, right? Now the buyer right to cancel, you have the seller contingencies and the seller contract obligations. Then you have the buyer right to cancel buyer contingencies, right? And so again, if you have a contingency and it doesn't happen and the contingency has not been already removed in writing, then you can cancel the contract. And now it gets into the fun and frivolity of every real estate transaction, which is a notice to buyer or seller to perform. And those are basically triggered off the time frame. And essentially the way it works is a buyer or a seller can send a respective notice to perform 2 days before a contingency is due to release. Well, that means that you need to release the contingency. What happens if you don't release the contingency? This is where it gets fun. It means that the respective party who has basically breached the contract may be canceled. You may be canceled by the other party, right? So again, the notice to buyer or the seller to perform is really important. And it also gets into counting days and how the days work. And then after we were talking about these contingencies, we talk about the effect of removing these contingencies and what it means for the removal of the buyer contingencies, what it means by the remover of the seller contingencies. Basically, if seller removes any contingency or cancellation rights unless otherwise agreed, seller has conclusively be deemed to have satisfied themselves regarding such contingency, elected to proceed with the transaction, and given up any right to cancel this agreement. So when you send that removal of all contingencies, all right, and you send that over, you're basically at that point, you're buying the house and the seller really can't cancel the listing. They can do things specific with performance, but that house is basically going to be sold. And that brings up the next part of this agreement, which is the demand to close escrow. And then if it doesn't close, right, if it doesn't close, then we're talking about the effect of cancellation on deposits. Then we're also talking about repairs again. Now we're talking about the final verification of condition, which was probably before the demand to close escrow. And now we're talking about the proration of property taxes and other items, which is really part of the escrow and how those fees are handled. And since we're now into the closing part of this statement, we're talking about the compensation paid to brokers and agents. And then again, we're reaffirming what the broker or the agent is responsible for and not responsible for in the scope of duty, and you should read that. And then we get into the joint escrow instructions to the escrow holder, and that basically is how the escrow works, and it's based on all these written agreements and addendums and advisories and everything like that that is part of the contract. And also, it pretty much tells you that you really need to make sure, if it's anything to do with the close of escrow, that these contractual documents are delivered to the escrow. So we talk about that there. And it talks about paying, again, the broker. This is where the broker's going to get paid. And then it also talks about, because of the escrow, the selection of service providers. And then it circles back to the multiple listing service about we're responsible to report some of the information about offer has been accepted, and upon the close of escrow, the sales price and other items of the transaction shall be provided to the MLS. It's usually the terms of the financing and any concessions. And then we also talk about attorney fees and costs, and it's good to know in any action, proceeding, or arbitration between the buyer and seller arising out of this agreement, the prevailing buyer or seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs from the non-prevailing buyer or seller, except as provided in paragraph 38. Now, first of all, you've agreed to mediation by default, so there's not going to be any attorney's fees paid unless they decide to pay, the loser decides to pay. So now we get into some of the technical parts or the legal aspects of what you're still doing with this, and it has to do with the assignee and the nomination and how that works. And basically, the seller needs to you need to have a separate written consent of the seller for the specific assignee. So you can't sit there and swap your property for any reason or without the knowledge of the seller agreeing to do so. And also, it just gets into the deal. Assignments and the nominations are usually discouraged in this market for obvious reasons. It causes a lot of issues about why this is happening. And again, it doesn't necessarily, it's not in everyone's best interest to do it when there is a different assignee, especially in regards to the broker for the buyer's agent. We talk about equal housing opportunity again, that the property is sold in compliance with federal, state, local, and anti-discrimination laws. And now we talk about all the definitions, which I went over in the earlier part of the video here. I'm getting tired, as you can tell. We talk about as is. We talk about authorized agent. Those were add. We talk about counting days a lot. We talk about what days or days mean, and what the delivery of documents is, and the legally authorized seller, and what repairs mean, and assigned versus signed. We talk about the terms and conditions of the offer. We talk about the time of essence of the contract and changes. We talk about the legally authorized signer. We talk about liquidated damages finally and how that works. And now we talk about mediation and how you defer to mediation unless you've gone to some additional aspects, or you've elected to have arbitration, and how that works, and how it needs to all be agreed to by the buyer and seller for arbitration. So if you want arbitration and as a buyer and the seller doesn't sign it, there is no arbitration. It is problematic, but you do have notice by initialing a space below you're agreeing to have any dispute arising on the matters included in the Arbitration of Disputes provisions decided by neutral arbitration as provided by California law, and you're giving up any rights you might possess to have this dispute litigated in a court or a jury trial. By initialing in the space below, you are giving up your judicial rights to discovery and appeal unless your rights are specifically included in the Arbitration of Disputes. I strongly urge anyone that is considering using arbitration, you probably need to understand the difference between arbitration and actually going to court, and that's well beyond the scope of my duties or responsibilities. So by default, it is basically mediation, and you agree to mediate, but there is an arbitration option. Now we talk about the buyer's offer and the expiration of the offers. And again, we talk about the entity buyers and the capacity of those people to the authority to sign the offer. And then we have said the RPA has 16 pages. Buyer acknowledged receipt and has read and understands every page and all attachments that make up this agreement. Again, we have spent a lot of time on this, almost an hour and 45 minutes. The reality is this is the problem with the new agreement. If you're seeing this thing for the first time, it is not in your best interest to sign this thing. You really need the time to understand what you're signing and the binding nature of this agreement and the implications with your tax and your legal professionals. And so we're almost done. We're almost done with this thing. We're going to talk about what happens, how acceptance works, and whether there's seller counteroffer, or whether you're a backup offer, and again, whether you're an entity seller. This is where this part is going to be delivered. The representative capacity of a seller comes up here. And again, we talk about the 16 pages again down here on C. And then we're talking about seller signatures, and then whether or not there are more than two signers, and that there's an additional signature addendum is there. And then we talk about whether the offer is not accepted, and we have gotten rid of the offer rejected. It's basically, if it's not accepted, that's essentially their non-response. That's accepted and rejected. I guess there was a fine line. And then we have what was on the old form with the real estate broker section, the escrow holder adjustment, and the presentation of the offer is here again. And there is, again, signature initials here for the buyer's initials and the seller's initials on this form. So this is kind of a form that at the end probably comes back a second time and gets signed as well because of, it's part of the thing. Now we talk about the BIA, which was referenced in several times, and basically this is the importance of property investigation, and as a stronger, you're strongly advised to do it. And it also talks that you're acting against the advice of a broker. So listen, we've spent a lot of time on this, far more than I ever thought was going to take to do this. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope if you glean anything out of this purchase agreement, it took me literally 2 hours to go over. And if you aren't spending at least 2 hours understanding what you're signing, because this isn't even fielding any of your questions or comments or concerns, you really need to do this purchase agreement review and understand it before you're in the middle of buying your home, your dream home, the home that you've searched for years, and not understanding how this form works and understanding the implications of this form. And as I said, I've spent 2 hours on it. So with that, I want to thank you for your time today. I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel, Cliff Stanwick Real Estate, if you would like my Facebook page at Cliff Stanwick Real Estate, or if you would come out and contact me on my website at stanwickre.com. I think this housing market is, there's some good opportunities to buy a nice home in this market. I know the rates are high, but homes are selling, and good homes are selling. And nobody has ever looked back, no matter when they bought 5 or 10 years, and have been stuck with a home. So if you have any needs, or you would like some help with buying or selling real estate, reach out to me. I wish you all the best in your search for home. Have a great day. Thank you.